Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. There's a debate currently dividing conservatives. In vitro fertilization, or IVF. This assisted reproductive technology has long been the subject of ethical debate, but recent legal and political developments have thrust it into the spotlight and sparked fierce disagreement on the right and the center-right, with libertarians also weighing into the debate. On one side are those who view IVF as a pro-family technology that helps couples struggling with infertility. On the other are those who argue it raises moral concerns about the sanctity of human life. The debate touches on fundamental questions of when life begins, the right of embryos, and the proper role of technology in human reproduction. One issue that is particularly fraught is the question of the disposition of embryos produced by IVF. For that reason, it's my pleasure to talk with Vanessa Brown Calder. Vanessa is the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where she focuses on policies that support family and increase opportunity. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Vero. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you. So before we start talking about IVF and honestly, all that news about IVF that I didn't know was going on in the country, I was just really stunned about how big of a deal of an issue it is and how overlooked it is. I want to ask you what I ask all my guests. How did you get where you are? I mean, what are the choices you've made, that made you an economist and then basically made you, study what you study?
Well, that is a great question. You know what? Family policy is something that's been interesting to me for some time now. I just think it's a very under-focused on issue from a libertarian standpoint. So, there's certainly conservatives that have focused on family issues of all different types for a long time and sort of dominated the conversation. And I think that that's true on the issue of IVF, on the issue of gestational surrogacy, now that these issues have become relevant, salient issues in the public debate. Many of the voices that you hear are coming from the conservative right. And so my thought with my current role is just that we need to have more of that libertarian, point of view as well, weighing in on really super critical issues like this that affect families so directly and that are so important to so many people across the nation.
Have you started looking at family policies from the moment you were in school, or is this something that you discovered more along the way?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I think it's always interested me, even in terms of the classes that I've taken and things like that, going back a ways. But certainly when I was at the Joint Economic Committee, in the Senate's Joint Economic Committee, when I was there was quite a bit of interest in some of these family issues. And when I was there, of course, I was thinking of starting a family myself. So maybe I took a little bit more additional personal interest in these issues as well.
And you and I have worked a lot on issue of federal paid leave. And we probably should do another episode specifically on this, because I think it's only bound to actually come back no matter who's elected.
Absolutely.
But the first time I read your work, it was actually you were working on housing policy, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you had published something with Peter Van Doren at Cato about housing policy.
That's right. And housing is something that is super important, obviously, from a family affordability perspective. And so it's something that I definitely continue to work on. And housing is a big focus for me, kind of like a bread and butter issue of mine. So something that I think is critical and is critical to families as well.
So last year, surrogacy was in the news, and this year it's IVF. It has really received quite a bit of attention, and quite a bit of attention, as I said, that the one who is not interested in this issue actually pays attention to. In February, I believe the Alabama Supreme Court declared that frozen embryos should be legally considered children, leading to many providers to halt IVF treatments. That led Alabama lawmakers to pass legislations that protects in vitro fertilization. And now we have proposals for federal legislation on this issue and more. So unless you're someone that's been through fertility treatment or like know someone who has, I assume that most people don't know what this is all about. So can you start by telling us, to people who may not know, really a little bit about what IVF and surrogacy are?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's important to understand the process itself, especially since, the public debate. One thing that I've learned listening in on the public debate is that people aren't super familiar with these medical processes. And so it's easy to kind of jump to the wrong conclusion if you're not familiar with how they work. So to start with, in vitro fertilization, or IVF, it is, just at the most basic level, it is a process that involves an egg being fertilized by sperm, and that happens outside the body in a laboratory dish. For listeners, again, that are not super familiar, it's a lengthy process. It requires a lot of tests, invasive testing, exams along the way. There's a ovarian stimulation phase where the patient takes hormones to stimulate the ovaries to produce eggs. And then there's a trigger shot to induce the maturation of those eggs. Then there is egg retrieval, followed by egg fertilization, again, outside the body in a laboratory dish. Then there's an embryo development, culturing phase. And finally, that embryo, at least a single embryo, sometimes more than one embryo, is transferred back to the patient's body. And at that point, there's generally a continuing regimen of drugs to ensure that the patient's body is as receptive as possible. And of course, eventually that's followed up with a pregnancy test to see if this whole thing worked. It's quoted as taking 4 to 6 weeks from initial consultation to that pregnancy test, but that, I think, really underestimates the timeline for most patients. There's a lot of uncertainty along the way, and patients have to make big decisions, and doctors have to advise them based on the tests that have come back. So it generally takes much longer. And gestational surrogacy is sort of all of that process, plus you add in an additional layer of complexity and another party altogether into it. Gestational surrogacy is when a woman carries a child for another couple. So in that type of surrogacy, it's by far the most common kind, the gestational carrier is not related to the child. In vitro fertilization is used to produce those embryos using the intended parent's genetic material, generally the intended parent's genetic material, maybe a donor egg or donor sperm, if for some reason the intended parents are not able to provide that genetic material themselves. So that's sort of IVF and gestational surrogacy in a nutshell. And gestational surrogacy, it adds even more length and complexity, as I mentioned, onto that process. It's more involved. I think that, intended parents are often quoted a year, that it might take an additional year to match and go through all the legal work, the paperwork, the tests, the medical tests, and all of that to set that process up, and then to have a child through gestational surrogacy. So those are those two processes.
Yeah. So while you were talking, I was thinking that, before we dive into the policy issues and the debate that exists right now, I think it's kind of worth taking a moment and actually kind of think about the fact that the people who decide to go through this have usually tried to have children without involving the technology. And they're just actually really, we're not going to be talking about actually how emotional and painful a process is. And I think it's just kind of worth thinking about it. When I was preparing for this interview, I read a fair amount of articles, including from some friend of ours who have gone through this process and have kind of said, we're going to talk about the polling, the policy, the process, and all this, but it's important to know what it's like to try to have a child and not be able to. And I think that makes this issue so important, because it's like, it's one of those, I mean, I guess a lot of issues, right, have a personal side, but this, I don't know why it actually moved me so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so emotional and so taxing, and, physically, emotionally, mentally, just everything is involved. And I think it's worth mentioning that people that find themselves doing IVF, they've tried other things before this. This is not something that you come to because you just enjoy being a patient or something. It's, you really, you know, become medicalized in this process. You are at the doctor's office, all the time. It could be every day. It could be, every other day for these monitoring appointments, exams, invasive testing, etc. So people do not enjoy this. And, most people would like to have a child the conventional, normal, stress free, nothing stress free in life, but the normal conventional way. So people are not signing up to do IVF because it's fun or because it's easy. It's a last resort.
I agree. And it really, it's a process ultimately that is meant to create life, which is also something that's worth remembering. So that reminds me, like, do you have demographic statistics about IVF and who uses it?
I have probably more on gestational surrogacy. Kind of what we know about IVF is that the folks that use it, again, they come to it generally having some type of either explained, sometimes unexplained fertility issue in vast, vast majority of cases. We hear about like the celebrity case, like, Paris Hilton, or I don't know, Kim Kardashian, or somebody like that, who there are rumors that, well, they did this because they wanted to protect themselves from the strain and the stress of pregnancy. And that's just, again, not the case in the vast, vast majority of cases. When it comes to gestational surrogacy, which is obviously a little bit different, people are coming to gestational surrogacy with often really major issues, whether that is biologic inability to conceive or bear a child. They might have, medical contraindication to pregnancy. They may be, let's say, missing a uterus or have some kind of abnormally shaped uterus or something like that. So major issues that cannot be mitigated by the typical in vitro fertilization process. So kind of on top of any IVF related issues that might be solved by IVF, or fertility issues that might have been solved by IVF, they generally have something more major going on as well. So we do have some data on that and what that population looks like. And as an example, and this is what you would expect, that population is way more likely to have uterine factor infertility diagnosis. That's 5 times more common in patients who use gestational carriers than in those that that are just using IVF. So there's something going on with the uterus specifically, which makes perfect sense because, with gestational carrier, that is the benefit, or one of the major benefits is that they have generally, they've had pregnancies that have been proven. They've had reasonably smooth pregnancies. And so they kind of know that this works for them and that it's relatively easy to get pregnant and relatively easy to stay pregnant. And so if you're somebody who's having trouble staying pregnant, let's say, then that might be a situation where you would look for a gestational carrier.
So since the Alabama court ruling, really, there's been a surprising number of critics that have come out of the woodwork to criticize both surrogacy and IVF, right? Or actually, I mean, it's I guess the IVF especially. What is this about? I mean, it's just like, once I started paying attention, it's just like I was amazed about the debate going on. So why is it getting so much attention now? Do you think it's because of the Supreme Court ruling, or what's happened? What's going on?
Well, my take is that I think the Dobbs decision really emboldened some of the more extreme factions of the pro-life crowd, since Roe was overturned at the federal level, kicking the issue of abortion down to the states. I think activists are feeling more confident after a big win, what they look at as a really big win. And they're looking for, looking for new material is really too dismissive. This is, if you are kind of to track some of the rhetoric about, the pro-life rhetoric back, and, an embryo is a person and that type of rhetoric back, then this would be the logical conclusion of some of that rhetoric. So, I think that they feel that they have made progress, major progress. And so they're looking at other places that they can make progress in their view as well. I think what's a little bit uncomfortable about this particular issue is that it's almost like you can be so pro-life, so extremely pro-life that you actually end up being anti-life. And I think that's sort of what's happening with IVF, is that, you have folks that are so extremely pro-life that actually the logical conclusion of some of their views or the statements that they've made would actually make it harder to produce life, to create life. And so that's, in my view, very unfortunate, of course. So I think that's one of the things.
It's also interesting to me because, Dobbs seems to me just the beginning of what it's the first step for the pro-life movement. Now they have to convince voters in the states, right?
Exactly.
It's just like Dobbs is not the end at all of that issue. And so they're like, if they're focusing on something else, it seems to be like missing, they're missing if they think that Dobbs, that's the end of the road, I think they're up for a big surprise. But
absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
So what are the main critics? What do they have to say against IVF?
So I think some of the concerns that I've seen or heard or read, they really run the gamut. They run the gamut from, let's say, interpretations of the proper way to procreate, which is based on their interpretation of Bible passages, to in my view, exaggerated concerns about the risks of IVF for patients. But one of the major concerns hinges on embryo loss. I think, we've sort of alluded to that already. The idea that not all of the embryos that are produced via IVF are transferred to a uterus, and not all embryos that are transferred to the uterus actually implant during IVF. Some are frozen, some are used later, some embryos are not used and they are discarded. In the case that embryos are not going to be used, they're not always discarded. I don't want to mislead on that front. There are a variety of things that patients can decide to do with them. They can donate them to another couple, which is called embryo adoption. They can donate them to science. They could pay those cryopreservation fees indefinitely and just keep them frozen indefinitely. There's something called a compassionate transfer, where you can basically transfer the embryos back to the patient's body, but at a sort of off-peak time during the cycle. And I've heard that can give, women that are IVF patients that have additional embryos, that can give them peace of mind. And then there is finally the possibility of discarding embryos. What I think that advocates are really getting wrong here is the degree to which they should actually, I guess, be concerned about the fact that there is embryo loss in these throughout the IVF process, and even at the end of the process if there are too many embryos that are made. And I'm not saying that it's not something that people should think about and make decisions in their own lives, and take this seriously if you are an IVF patient, and think about the ethical or moral implications from your own viewpoint. But I do think that the way that activists are talking about this in a very black and white way is quite unfair to the fact that the human conception process is very inefficient. It's very messy. There are, what I've seen in the medical literature is that nearly 70% of conventional human conceptions do not survive to live birth. The body also discards embryos in the process of trying to create life. And, IVF and conventional conception are not so different in that regard. Though with IVF, of course, the embryo loss occurs outside the body in the lab, sometimes inside the body if there's a miscarriage. And it does happen as the result of generally more like conscious processes. But I think, again, it's not so dissimilar when you really start to think about how the body also produces embryos. It loses those embryos. Those embryos never implant. Sometimes those embryos implant and are discarded. And going back to just the big picture, which you've mentioned already, I think we do need to keep the big picture in mind here, which is that patients that are doing IVF, they are doing IVF with the intention of making embryos that will become human life. They're not trying to create embryos just to discard them. They are creating embryos with the intention of creating life, just as the human body creates embryos with the intention of creating human life.
Yeah, and I think when you were talking, I was actually thinking that the loss of embryo, while is not one to be disregarded entirely, usually the couples who go and use embryo, often they go after having suffered many miscarriages, right? And so, I mean,
definitely,
it's like, so it's just another way of trying to have a baby. It's really not to say that these are not things we should be thinking about, but I think it's interesting that they're drawing such a bright line between the two.
Definitely.
And so since IVF is used during gestational surrogacy, I guess it would be fair to assume that critics are concerned about many of the same issues, plus additional surrogacy specific concerns. And so what are these?
Yeah, so critics of gestational surrogacy argue that gestational carriers are exploited, that there are physical and mental risks to gestational carriers as they go through this process. They worry about the children that result from surrogacy and suggest that the children are negatively impacted. And, they've also made claims that surrogate pregnancies, or sometimes there are news, articles that say such and such a gestational carrier pregnancy was aborted. And activists will really latch on to that and say, look, this is happening. Surrogate pregnancies are being aborted. And they imply that it's at a higher than usual rate, which I think is very, very unlikely based on all the information that we have.
Yeah. So one of my best friends actually carried a baby for her brother and sister-in-law. And that I met her, she was effectively during her fourth pregnancy. She had 3 kids of her own, and she carried that baby. She was carrying that baby for her brother and sister-in-law. And, I'm sure there are problems that exist, but I also have gay friends who've actually used surrogates. So do you think actually ultimately this is what it's about? It's about a couple of gay men, a couple of gay women who want to have a baby and basically kind of have a family life like everyone else. Do you think that could be at play? I mean, I don't want to disparage anyone or kind of, assume these intentions that this is what they have in mind. But I do wonder.
I definitely think that that's part of what's going on here. I think that there's maybe some just disgust or revulsion around this idea of another woman carrying a couple's baby for them. I think that there's kind of just some kind of deeply held reaction to that some people have, and that conservatives are more likely to have, it seems, than folks in other, camps or other places on the ideological spectrum. But I do think, based on the reaction to stories about gay men having children through gestational surrogacy, which again is it receives a lot of attention, but it's also not the typical, average experience. But I think that based on the reaction from some of these activists to those type of stories, there's definitely a level of deep skepticism, dislike, whatever it is.
How often does it happen? I mean, how much does it happen in a year?
So surrogacy itself, I tried to do I tried to estimate exactly how many times gestational surrogacy resulted in live births in a year. And the number that I came up with was about 4,000 live births annually were produced as a result of gestational surrogacy. So like a really small number, a little more than 2% of births are the result of IVF. And then gestational carrier embryo transfer cycles comprise less than 5% of all of those embryo transfers that happen via IVF. So it is a very, very small group. But it just receives so much attention because it's unusual, it's different, it's unique. It's not the way that people generally expand their families. So then out of that percentage, to what degree, what percentage of that very small number are intended parents that are, LGBTQ. I don't have the numbers on that. And I don't think that we have national numbers on that. CDC does not collect that information. But my best guess is that it is the minority of those births as well.
So you authored a study last year defending gestational surrogacy. So what are the main things? What are the main arguments that actually critics of surrogacy get wrong?
Well, so I think on the gestational surrogacy side, critics, as we've sort of alluded to, they're frequently highlighting individual stories that fit some either dated stereotypes about surrogacy or that generally are just don't reflect the current research. I don't think that their claims across the board hold up very well once you look at the current medical research on gestational surrogacy. So the first claim that I mentioned in that paper is just that gestational carriers in the US, that they're exploited according to activists or critics. I think that they're not exploited by any measure that you look at.
Some of them are compensated or not.
Definitely.
I don't even
yes.
know. Yeah.
It's legal in the US to compensate gestational carriers. And of course, there are some, like probably in the case of was it your brother-in-law? Sorry, Vero.
My friend.
Your friend.
One of my really good friends.
Your very good friend. Yeah, in that case, not compensated. So it can be sort of a gift that somebody gives somebody that they know well in some cases. If it's not someone that you know well, then oftentimes it will be compensated. And generally, gestational carriers are personally compensated somewhere between $30,000 to $60,000. But then on top of that, all of the legal fees, medical fees, delivery costs, all of that is paid for as well. So when you actually add all of that up, what intended parents are paying comprehensively is somewhere between, I think it's like $100,000 and $250,000. So that's a pretty big chunk of change for pretty much anyone. So gestational carriers are compensated. They're voluntarily entering into surrogacy contracts. They're generally informed of the risks, both medical risks and also psychological potential risk. The surveys that I have seen suggest that there is very little evidence of post-surrogacy regret, and that many gestational carriers say that they would consider becoming surrogates again, which, if they were feeling exploited or like they were being treated unfairly in this process, it would be hard to understand how they would want to go forward and do it all over again. So I think there's a lot of research that suggests and surveys that suggest information that's available that indicates that gestational carriers don't feel exploited. And then another claim that critics make is that gestational carriers are somehow negatively impacted psychologically, or that they're negatively impacted from a medical perspective. But medical research finds that gestational carriers have positive long-term psychological outcomes. And I guess I would say, although pregnancy and fertility treatment, they're not risk-free endeavors, right? So there are things that go wrong, whether you are someone who, you are the patient, the woman who is having the child, you're doing IVF, whether you have a conventional pregnancy or whether you're a gestational carrier, certainly things can go wrong. Creating life is just not risk-free.
Yeah.
Medical procedures in general aren't risk-free, but the medical outcomes for gestational carriers resemble the general population of women utilizing IVF. So it's basically the same as if the woman herself was to go through, like the risks that are there because of the IVF process are similar for gestational carriers, and if the patient was to carry the child herself. The other thing that activists say that I kind of mentioned is that children resulting from surrogacy are impacted negatively, but the medical research we have shows that children from surrogacy do well from a psychological standpoint and from a medical standpoint. And finally, on the issue of abortion, surrogate pregnancies are substantially less likely to be terminated than conventional pregnancies. And that's for so many different reasons. I mean, these are very intentional pregnancies where people, again, have put likely years of effort into, trying to have a child. And so they're not going to be keen to abort the child. It's a very costly process in terms of time, emotional effort, and all of the other things. So just very unlikely that surrogate pregnancies are aborted. And, occasionally they probably are, as all pregnancies are, but from the survey that we did at Cato anyways, and the data that we were able to pull, it looks like the abortion rate is like 1/10 of the national abortion rate. So,
yeah. But plus it doesn't seem to be in the interest, especially in the case of surrogacy, when people are paid to carry a child. I mean, getting an abortion, unless it is because there's a physical or a health risk, I mean, it doesn't seem really to jive with the incentives that are put in place.
Totally. Yeah. The incentives for everyone are to see the pregnancy through, and certainly true from the gestational carrier standpoint, because a lot of times they're getting paid on a monthly basis and, paid all the way up until delivery. So they're not going to want to abort the child from that perspective. But also, I think maybe more important than that, probably much more important, is the fact that at least the surveys that we have, and again, data in this area is it's a little hit or miss. It's small populations. I think we should probably say that that's a caveat to this whole conversation. People feel probably rightly that this is personal, private information. So it's hard to get people to agree necessarily to share private health information. But the information that we have about gestational carriers, they say that they are really loath to abort the child that they're carrying for the intended parents. And I think part of that might be that the gestational carrier population leans more heavily evangelical. So they kind of have their own views on, pregnancy and life and where it begins and all of those things. But again, just more reasons why surrogate pregnancies are substantially less likely to be terminated than conventional pregnancies.
I also imagine that when it comes to collecting the data, the fact, I mean, it's probably data that exists at the state level, if it exists, and then it needs to there's just probably no national database or I can see how difficult it is to actually collect data for this.
Yeah. There's CDC data at the national level, but the CDC data is mostly so they collect data from fertility clinics, and the data that the CDC collects is focused on how successful those clinics were. So how successful their embryo transfers were at producing a live birth, and that type of information, which is really more again, trying to understand how effective these fertility clinics are at doing their job of creating life. So it's sort of like one slice of the data, it's one lens, and it's really helpful if you're someone who is going through fertility treatment. You can actually look and compare different fertility clinics across the country and see what their outcomes are like. So that's really useful. But yeah, we don't have just oodles of data available on every question related to IVF or gestational surrogacy. That's for sure.
Actually, this is a question I'm curious about is like, how successful is it? Because I have to imagine that not only, the couples who are trying to conceive through IVF have gone through a lot already, but it doesn't always work, right?
Yeah.
Because usually there's a reason behind the difficulty of giving birth in a natural way. So what are the success rates for IVF?
Yeah, I have that information here somewhere, Vera. I've looked at a bunch of things. It depends. So it really varies depending on a whole bunch of different factors, right? So if you are a 20-year-old going through IVF versus a 30-year-old versus a 40-year-old, just the number of times that you're going to have to do it to have embryos that are, that develop properly and that are high enough quality that they can be transferred back to the uterus is going to vary quite a bit. I think what I've read, the HHS put out a sort of a fact sheet about IVF earlier this year, and they said that the average patient has to go through 2.5 treatment cycles in order to become pregnant through IVF. So that sort of gives you a general sense of how likely it is. But yeah, it can be, it could be 50% likelihood that transfer is going to result in a pregnancy. It could be 60%. It could be 20% and anything in between. So it kind of just depends on what type of fertility issues you're dealing with, what are the specifics of those issues and your age and other factors.
And I can imagine that the older you get, the harder it is.
Definitely.
And I think I think you and I were talking about the case in Israel, right? IVF is fully reimbursed. And as a result, so Israel is is still having just a lot of children. They don't seem to have, I think that the decline to see that any decline in fertility that pretty much the rest of the world is seeing. And some people are talking about how the fact that IVF is part of the reasons. I think it's IVF and cultural, I assume, because it's hard for me to imagine that IVF is just the solution. But one of the things that I had read is as a result of actually the widespread availability of IVF treatments, but also the fact that it's reimbursed, some women decide to postpone pregnancy and hence making it more difficult to actually get success with IVF.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting unintended consequence of such a policy, which, I think we should take that seriously. There are definitely people that want IVF to be covered or subsidized. And of course, those folks are left of center. But certainly if there's a view or a reality that IVF is subsidized or covered at any age in any circumstance, then yeah, people are going to react to the incentives there. So not surprisingly, like we would expect them to think that through.
Are they national polling about support for IVF and surrogacy?
There is certainly on IVF. It's been a little while since I looked at surrogacy, but there is some polling on surrogacy too. What I can say about the IVF polling is that IVF is broadly very popular. So, it's something like 10% of women ages 15 to 44 have gone through fertility treatment themselves. And then I think it's a majority of folks have either gone through it themselves or someone close to them has gone through fertility treatment. And so because of that, it's just become much less, at one point it may have been stigmatized. I think that's no longer. So IVF is broadly very popular. I want to say it's like, 85% or so of folks support the concept of IVF, support IVF. When it comes to gestational surrogacy, I believe it's probably got less popular support, but also less polling, like less recent polling, less
because it's
good
really a subset.
polling.
I mean, it's really a subset of those getting IVF. So it's really a small sample. But so let's talk about the politics of it. If it's mostly supporting, is there like a political bias of those who are anti-IVF or surrogacy or both?
Yeah, I've just seen folks right of center. So kind of like social conservatives, as we talked about a little bit more earlier on, the policymakers that have come out against IVF are definitely right of center. So there's a Republican in the House who he introduced some amendments. This was maybe a month ago that would have prohibited the use of Department of Defense funding for IVF. And, he emphasized that IVF is immoral. There's another House congressman, Republican.
Here he was mixing two issues, right? He was mixing, because I guess you and I have no problem with not using public funds for it. That sounds fine. That's fine. But it's a whole other issue than to say we shouldn't do it. People shouldn't be allowed to do it.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not so concerned about whether or not on the specific question of whether Department of Defense funding should be used for IVF services or not. It's more kind of like the rhetoric around it that he's generally just opposed and was kind of looking for a way to plant his flag that he's opposed to IVF. And, the other Congressman Burchine, I think that's how you say it, lesser known congressman, wrote a letter to the CDC demanding answers about IVF embryo loss earlier this year. So again, another Republican. I know at the state level, there's a Republican in Alabama who likened clinics' destruction of embryos to a Holocaust, and he advocated keeping the pause on IVF in the state. So definitely it seems to be a right of center thing to be critical of IVF. But fortunately, I think for the time being, the politics of restricting IVF don't really map well. The new Trump 2.0 Republican Party,
I was going to say, didn't the platform say something about the Republican platform, the weird bullet point Republican platform? Didn't have something about IVF?
Yeah, it said that Republicans will support mothers and policies that advance prenatal care, access to birth control, and IVF, specifically IVF. So I think as long as Trump is at the head of the Republican Party, or at least as long as he's up for re-election, I doubt that the IVF critics make much headway at the federal level.
But you said the word embryo loss, and I realized we haven't talked about that. I mean, in fact, it's kind of interesting because the first time I got aware of this, it's like I was basically reading you on Twitter debating some obscure number about embryo loss. So what is it we should know about embryo loss?
Yeah, well, some people think, embryo loss, I don't know, this issue doesn't matter to them because the folks out there, either they have the view that it's not acceptable to lose any embryos, no matter what, in which case you would oppose IVF, or on the other hand, it's okay if you lose embryos and there's not really anything in between. But I actually think that the numbers do matter, and critics have exaggerated the embryo loss numbers. And I think the reason for doing that is probably to try to make a more persuasive case that this is an issue that people should pay attention to.
So you're saying that actually it is something we should morally think about, this issue of embryo loss, but the action of kind of making it sound as if it's happening just a lot is actually counterproductive, basically.
I think just from a personal perspective, if I was a patient going through IVF, it's something that I would consider. I think that you can come to a variety of different views on the question of embryo, what to do about embryos that you're not using or that you can't use if you're an IVF patient.
And you said there are a bunch of options actually that are available to people.
There's a bunch of different options available. Yeah. And so, if you're somebody that feels more sensitive on this issue, then you may want to go down the compassionate transfer route, transfer the embryos back to your own body and kind of get some peace from that. Or maybe you're somebody who feels like absolutely you have to transfer every embryo and give every embryo a shot. I think that is a totally valid viewpoint as well. So I guess I just don't think that there's one viewpoint that makes sense to enforce on everyone, which is the view of the IVF critics, where they think their view is that an embryo is a person. I think that is a more extreme view on the spectrum of views.
Isn't that the view of the Supreme Court of Alabama now?
Yeah, well, that was sort of the Supreme Court ruling was actually the lead justice, the chief justice. I'm not a lawyer here, so I've got to think about my terms that I'm using to describe. The chief justice did have kind of more of a theological take on, what an embryo is, where life begins. And so that is one viewpoint that's out there. The other justices did not take that same position. They had a more moderate view. And they said, look, this is not something that the court should legislate on, but the legislature should think these questions and these ethical issues over. And in fact, there was a justice who basically wrote a concurring opinion saying that he was worried about, the implications of the court's ruling on basically like reproductive practices and fertility treatment. I don't know that he used that exact term, but he kind of worried about the downstream effects of the court's ruling. And of course, as we know, the downstream effects were that 3 of the major clinics in the state closed or halted their operations immediately. So he was not wrong to worry about that.
But they passed a legislation, right, to protect.
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, they did.
Are these clinics able to reopen? I mean, I haven't followed.
Yeah. Yep. They reopened, and Alabama state legislature pretty quickly, within a month, I want to say, passed legislation which protected doctors and patients in such a way that they felt comfortable going forward and continuing to provide IVF services. So I guess I would just say, although this has been resolved in the state of Alabama for the time being, I think more broadly across the U.S. and various different states across the U.S., this type of question of kind of like, where does life begin? What does conception mean? What choices do people have? And, how does the abortion debate relate to fertility services and the ability to provide those services? I think that is something that is going to continue to be an issue over the remainder of the year into 2025 and the years that follow, just as states are now sorting through are wheedling through how to approach abortion policy following the Dobbs decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what do you think the future holds for would-be parents?
Well, I think, we need to sort of, in light of the conversation that we just had to your last question, I think we need to be vigilant at the state level, and policymakers need to think through the implications of state abortion policy for fertility treatment. But I think at the federal level anyways, things look relatively positive at the moment. I think the really key thing is on the public policy side that we continue to try to be clear about the benefits of these procedures, because a lot of times critics, as would be suggested by their name, they are focused on whatever they perceive as trade-offs. But we need to be clear about what the benefits are, which is namely that both IVF and gestational surrogacy, it creates life. And we need to be clear about who the beneficiaries are of that procedure, those procedures, and those are parents that are genuinely, desperately trying to expand their families, which is a sympathetic group of people for good reason. And I think if we are clear about sort of the benefits of these of these medical processes, then public opinion is going to continue to be on the side of fertility treatment. And politicians that veer too far away from that are going to be penalized, which is a positive thing. And, the more fringe views will continue to be relatively fringe, I think. So I think that the future can be good, and we should work to make it that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me about this, because honestly, before I started reading your work, I really didn't know anything. And when I started pulling, I realized kind of what a big debate had been going on that I didn't knew was going on. And I kind of took things for granted. As I said, I actually know two people who had kids through surrogacy, and I just, and I know it was difficult, even though it was certainly difficult. They came to this conclusion, because things were not going well, and it just kind of it's hard. I'm thinking of those two kids in particular now, and it's just like to kind of think that there are some people who think that somehow this is not all worth it. But people, they have and it's not that I'm actually dismissing the moral issues and all the important kind of moral questions that come with using technology to create life and discarding embryos and all of that. I mean, these are important questions thinking about. But when you see the results, I'm like, oh, I'm all for it. So Thank you so much, Vanessa, and good luck in continuing your work.
Thank you, Vero. Appreciate you having me on. It's been a pleasure.